Peter Boyles, former talk show host, the morning show on 710 KNUS, and along with Mark Crowley and Brian Taylor and Kelly Michaels, we have developed something that I've called the shoot, and it comes from pro wrestling where there are works and shoots, and this is a shoot, and this is the 14th of the shoots that we've done, and we've been getting lots of hits, as they say, or views on it. It's been wonderful. Last week, Lee Larson sat here, who was, in my mind, probably the finest radio executive that has ever existed. And then this man, who I've talked about so many times, and having the ability to do talk radio. For the 14th show, none other than the man, Mike Rosen, came in, two old guys sitting talking about radio. Thank you first for doing this.
Two old guys, huh?
Well, we weren't old guys.
True.
Yeah.
Just the calendar.
We need a bench and some pigeons, some squirrels.
Yeah.
And I ask you how your health is.
Not as good as it was when I was a lot younger. Sign me up with everybody else who's our age.
Man, how many years?
Of how many years? How old am I?
Yeah, you and I are
77.
Same age. Yeah, we're same age.
Yeah.
So I'm 78. You had 42 years in the business?
42 years in radio, my second career. Seriously. Made a crossover from my corporate career.
People get to ask things about, what's the lesson? Larson sat here and Mandy Connell's done it and Stefan, a couple of guys. But one of the things that we said before this began is when you and I were first working together, who's left?
Wow. Probably nobody.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think of the names of all of
Hal
those.
and Charlie.
Gone.
Charlie and Marty.
Gone.
Yeah. Van Curious, is Van still around?
I'm Curious Van.
Yeah. That's how I got my first job at the KWBZ.
With Van?
Van, yeah.
And
John Mullins, the
John
younger.
John may still be.
Yeah.
But Corky Cartwright's, those guys, all legends are gone. John Lego's gone. Just so many of those legendary names. And I think one of the things I wanted to do with the series, if it has any meaning, is to capture these men and women like yourself before it gets away. And somebody could say, well, didn't that guy used to do a radio show in Denver?
This reminds me of the Holocaust, talking to Holocaust survivors, so it doesn't go away.
Ooh, did you survive it?
I don't think radio's as bad as Holocaust.
No. Better class of people. Came back. So people talk about, and it was in all the papers. Yeah. And then they ended your career, which I thought was really none of my business. I thought it was kind of chicken. There's a word that follows that, but.
Well, no, I've started phasing out of my career about 5 years ago when I gave up 5-day-a-week radio. And the arrangement I made with KOA, which was beneficial for both of us, I just want to do it part-time. I'll fill in, do a movie review segment if you like. And they were fine with that, probably because it was financially attractive to them, since I still had some clients I did endorsements for. Sure. And I kept those sponsors. We make a talent fee in this business when we do endorsements, and you and I were very careful about who we endorse and who we don't.
You bet.
And for every dollar I make, the radio station makes about 4 times that in what they charge for the spot fee. So I did that for several years. And then in the last round of financial setbacks for the parent company, for iHeart, they've done what they've been doing for a long time, trying to stay in business. And with all the radio stations all over the country, which was once more than 1,000, they just have layoffs. Now, in my case, I was only working part-time anyway. So, and I was ready. I had already decided myself at the end of this year I was just going to walk away from it. So when they had this latest round, and Brenda, who's our new boss there, this was an edict that came down from headquarters, and I said, I'm fine with that, no problem. And some other people who were working full-time got fired. Yeah. I wasn't really fired.
There's this economic theory called shrink to profit. And what is the most expensive item in the line? Well, it's manpower. Yeah. But there was a time, and Larson was sitting here, we were talking about it, you had promotions people, backup people, copywriters, on-air people, and the stations had greater numbers, and they made much more money.
Right.
What happened?
Well, there was consolidation in the industry.
Because?
Instead of independent stations, they had big networks that picked up a lot of different stations. Salem, iHeart, Clear Channel, J-Core, things like that. Also, in this day and age right now, on-the-air radio doesn't really know where it's going to go. Podcasts, streaming, anybody in the world can be a talk show host.
You bet.
Just start a podcast.
Sure.
Some of them are doing well. The vast majority aren't, but it's a hobby for them, or an ego trip. And right now, first of all, during the pandemic, companies like our parent company, iHeart, lost something like 50 or 60% of their radio advertising instantly when restaurants, for example, were closed. They don't advertise anymore. Now, with a recession looming, one of the first casualties of a recession is radio advertising. And I'm sure that's one of the reasons they're cutting back on personnel right now in anticipation of that. So that's the business.
But even in those rougher times, because there were other recessions, and in fact, as an amateur history reader, the beauty of radio is getting America through the Great Depression. And it really is the golden age of radio, is the Great American Depression into the Second World War.
Franklin Roosevelt on fireside chats.
Remember Jimmy Carter tried to replicate that.
Yeah, with his cardigan sweater.
And the little fire in the back on it just didn't work out.
Mayor LaGuardia read the comic strips to kids
when
on
the newspapers
weekends.
go on strike. That's right. He reads Dick Tracy to the children of New York.
Do you remember Dick Tracy's two-way wrist
radio? Oh, yeah.
What, in the 1940s or 50s?
We got those.
It came to pass.
Oh, yeah.
And it keeps track of your blood pressure, too.
When you were a kid, when I'm bouncing all over, Mike Rosen, of course, Peter Boyles, all together again, you read the papers, you listened to radio, you're a huge sports fan, because that's going to bring us back to what happened to radio. You grew up on radio.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I used to listen to the Yankees games on radio. Of course, you could watch them on TV as well, but when you're out playing with the kids in the street, with no soccer moms taking you to organized leagues, you played sandlot ball. But yeah, listen to the Yankees on the radio. Mel Allen doing the broadcast. How about that, he would say.
I've written about it, walking home in Pittsburgh, you know, the alleys and the streets and stuff, and nobody had air conditioning. I mean, that was kidding me, but remember those expander screens? You'd put them in a window and make them wide or make them high.
Yeah.
And their moms would put radios in the windows because they're making dinner, and it was an industrial blue collar. I could walk home and I could listen to the game.
Yeah.
Because everybody's mom had KDKA, Bob Prince, the Gunner, and we had them all the way. And there was a lot of day games then. And you could walk home. If I had a job, walking home, you could hear the games coming home.
Talking about air conditioning.
Yeah.
You remember when you'd walk past a movie theater in the 1950s when you didn't have an air conditioner at home, or if you were lucky you had a window fan?
Yeah.
And they had the big glass doors that were the whole front right by the booth where you bought your ticket.
You could feel
They'd keep them open, and the cool air, and they had signs saying it's cool inside.
When Pittsburgh was in the bars. They put the bars out there. But remember, they always had like silver foil blowing.
That's right. Yes.
And a fan on it or something. And a different time. What's happened to newspapers? Same thing. What's happened to radio? Well, as I said, Larson was here, and after that...
Let me echo what you said about Lee.
Yeah.
I worked with Lee Larson for decades. In radio, a lot of people come up through the various elements of it. On-air people go into management sometimes. Not all of them had management experience, and not all of them are good managers. Somewhere, Lee Larson was the single best manager in the entire industry.
He sat here and I said that to him.
And all the contracts I had with KOA were mano a mano, me and Lee, and I never had a lawyer.
No.
Just the two of us.
I think in and out of life, and so many different walks of life, Larson is one of the finest, if not one of the finest men I've ever known. And his word was solid. And I was mentioning when he was sitting here, he had a button. Remember, he had a desk button. Yeah. Well, you tell the story. You come in his office, he touched the button, the door would close. Whoa.
That was to keep you from escaping, too.
Yeah.
It was locked.
He was so great. And I said, one of the great things about him, and God knows we all screwed up, or at least I did, before you left, he'd say something good to you. And I said,
don't let the door hit you on your way out.
he said, but even like, look at the people he was dealing with. I mean, he was dealing with some pretty nutty people at one time, but he always would give you the little, pat on it, say, good job. And no, he's a one of a kind. And then there's the other ones. And how did you, I mean, we don't need to use names, but we know who they were. We know who these people were. You went through some pretty interesting programmers.
Yeah, all of whom not all of whom. No, there were some really good ones too. Greg Foster was
good
great.
man.
Robin Bertolucci was
right,
really good.
Right.
Some of them, however, tried to manage me, and I'm sorry, that just wasn't in the cards.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certain general principles that we adhere to. That's fine. You know, don't dump on sponsors, for example.
There's one. There's one.
You hear a really terrible commercial, and you're tempted to come back on the air, and you know, no, you don't do that.
No, don't do that.
But they weren't going to make me into something I didn't want to be, and because I had a very clear goal and I made my crossover from my corporate career. I was a corporate finance executive. I'm pretty good at it. I've got an MBA by background.
Come on.
And if you want to get into it, I'll tell you how I made my crossover. But to stay on my point, when I made that decision, I decided I wanted to be a player in the war of ideas. I wanted to inform and influence public opinion. That was my goal. I'm partisan, I'm biased, and I've always explained that to people on the air. I'm not a reporter. I'm not a journalist in that regard. I'm a commentator.
We don't owe you anything.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And all of us are biased. The vast majority of people who are supposed to be delivering news in the media, in any element of the media, they all have opinions. They're all biased. Some of them are intentionally spinning the news, but they don't admit it.
Yeah.
And I don't spin the stuff, but I do give out, I do reveal what my biases are. Fair enough. Anyway, that was why I went into the business. And there's an entertainment element of what we do, and we're all entertaining in different ways. Limbaugh was a different kind of entertainer than I was. Not right or wrong, it's just different. But I wasn't an entertainer first and foremost because my goal was to inform and influence public opinion, and I did it. And I had a couple of program directors that tried to take me off my path.
I remember all of that, sure.
I was diplomatic in our discussions. I didn't get in their face. I even would nod sometimes and say, well, I'll consider that. But I did what I wanted to do.
The bottom line, I've said this to so many people and so many times, it's ratings that equal revenue that equals ratings. And you always more than carried your end of the stick. And we both know that. You don't have a divine right to a radio show, even though there are some people that believe they're on a mission from God doing radio. We knew, or at least I know you knew, that this was a money-making proposition. And talk about that as opposed to how some of this other stuff goes.
Well, that was my leverage.
Yeah,
by the way,
you made money
at various points along my career. Live endorsements are much more effective, for the most part, than production spots.
And the reason is the same voice that's talking about Donald Trump or economic policy is now selling cars. You sold cars for Stevenson for how many years? Wow. I mean, that was a lifetime. I had my relationship with John Medved. And but the voice doesn't change. In other words, we're not going to, and one of the big mistakes that on-airs make is, we'll be back after this. Well, you're just giving an okay here. And you never did that. You know, the same seamlessness of talking about politics or whatever, baseball, whatever we're talking about, then you're selling cars.
When you hear me get into an endorsement vein, it sounds like it's programming, because it is programming. It's not like we're cutting to commercials. I was a very profitable, I was a profit center for KOA, that 9 to noon block that I had.
You made them money.
When I did the math one time, keep in mind, the station is selling 60-second spots for $400 or more back in the day. I don't think they're getting that kind of a spot rate today. So they get their share of that, and I get maybe a quarter of it. By the way, my talent fees were higher than anybody else's at the station. I negotiated those myself with my clients, and they were willing to pay it because they worked. In any event, because I was bringing in so much money, and because if you get fired from one radio station, you can go to another.
And show them your performance.
And bring my sponsors with me as well.
I did it here.
I think they were grossing between $4 and $5 million from 9 to noon.
I absolutely believe it, sure.
And if there was some friction, and there wasn't very much of it, but some disagreements with some program director, what are you going to do, let me walk? It's not good business for you.
Well, what was the line to Godfrey? Always made his partners money.
Very good.
And if you do that in this business, And the old timers taught us that. You know, the guys that said, you know, here, read this. Well, what you did, and I actually learned it from Alan Berg is where I learned it. Come on, let's go see the guy.
Oh, sure.
And you had, I know you had a relationship with Stevenson. I know you had relationships with these.
Well, hundreds of sponsors over the years,
Point
and
is,
some of them for 20 and 30 years.
Point is.
Yeah, and you and I would make sales calls with sales reps.
Still do.
Part of the job. Some people who get into the business don't understand that.
The divine right.
I'm sure your work week is probably the same as mine.
Yeah.
I was on air for 15 hours a week. I'd get in early to do show prep. I'd hang around the station to deal with some people there. I, of course, would be doing reading 24/7 all the time to be prepared, visiting clients, having lunch with clients. I worked a 70-hour week
No, I know.
for almost 40 years.
When people would say things.
Loving what I do.
Mike,
Yeah.
this business, and we've talked about it so many times, when I listen to people grind on the business, and I go, what are you talking about? I mean, this has been the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to me and to my family, and I suspect it may be the same for you, that, my heavens, you're Mike Rosen, but look at me now, kind of a thing, you know, and it happened because, number one, you're extremely talented, you were a risk taker, but you understood the rules, and it worked.
Talk about risk taking. When I made my crossover, I was in, and this is back in 1979 and 80.
I was going to say 78, I thought 79.
You and I started together in December of 1980. After I'd come back from the Pentagon, you remember I had that stint working.
Don't I ever.
I was Special Assistant for Financial Management to the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the Pentagon. This was a White House exchange program between the corporate sector and the private sector.
And you were here, but you were here with Samsonite, right?
I was working with Samsonite. Our parent company, Beatrice, had agreed to be part of this program. We took someone from the government. The next year, I returned the favor and went to Washington. It was the turning point of my life.
Who was president? Carter?
Carter was president. It was a nonpartisan program. And I used to listen to Pat Buchanan and Tom Braden on WRC in Washington. They had a 4 to 7 p.m. Early evening drive program.
It was a popular show, too.
And political talk is to Washington as Bronco talk is to Denver. Washington is a government town, a company town. The company is government. Everybody in Washington listened to Braden and Buchanan, including me when I was driving home from a beautiful home I rented in Great Falls, Virginia. Pentagon was on the other side of the Potomac, the Virginia side. And at one point I said, I could do that. I could do that, and I want to do that. Now, after my Pentagon stint was over, by the way, you'll love this. I was a civilian equivalent. I was a GS-15, civilian equivalent of a rear admiral. When I was in the Army, I was an E5. You were an E5 too, weren't you? Sergeant Spec 5, whatever it is. When I visited a naval base, and I visited naval bases all over the country working for the Navy, and I'd stay at the BOQ, that's where guests stayed visiting. Bachelor Officer Quarter was called. They'd have a little pegboard welcoming all the guests. Panama City Naval Base welcomes Admiral Jones, Vice Admiral Smith,
Mike Rosen,
Mr. Rosen, and then Captain Jones.
Oh, below that.
4-striper Navy captains are below my. I always got a big kick out of that. So, but anyway, I was in six-figure income territory in 1980 when I made my crossover.
That's a lot of money.
And when I went to work for KWBZ,
what were we getting paid? What were we getting
I got
paid?
$40,000 a year. That's what they paid me, $40,000.
That was about right.
Yeah, which was a hell of a cut in pay. I have a wife and 2 kids.
Yeah.
But I knew in my back pocket I was very good at what I did. Strategic planning, mergers, acquisitions, corporate finance analysis, that kind of thing. I knew I could always go back to that. But it turns out that that wasn't my life calling, I thought.
Did you know when you sat down for the first time you wanted to do it? Or
maybe radio?
Yeah.
You bet. Very first minute. You know, but I didn't have mic fright. I had done many presentations to audiences in the corporate environment. I did a lot of speaking when I was working for the Pentagon. I wasn't nervous about that kind of thing, and I was prepared. You know me, I'm the classic over prepare type A personality.
Yeah.
So
I always tell these, like, not to take it away, read the book. The guy's coming on the show with you. Read his book. And how many times, and I know you're a great reader, and they'd say, hey, thanks for, I said, no, thank you. I read, you know, and Larry King, who I never was a big fan of, always said, I don't read the book. And the reason is, then the listener and I are the same.
what a cop out.
Oh,
he was just lazy.
And I know you're a reader.
Yeah.
I know because we've crossed over
I
with
had
people.
guests who would actually say, I can't believe it. I've done a dozen radio. You read my book.
Every time.
Yeah.
Every time. And you take the time to do that. But
now, by the way, a guy's got a 500-page book, and you're reading everything to stay current. You can't read every word of every book. But if I have a couple of hours, I can go through a book with my highlighter, make notes in the margin. I have done a really good scanning job on the book, and sometimes that's the only practical way to do it.
what are you reading right now? What are you reading now?
Did you, are you familiar with 2034?
No.
It's a novel of the Third World War. It's by Admiral Stavridis.
Wow. Okay.
I'm not reading that right now. I've finished it already, but it's in a radio context. And I had him on the show after I read the book. It's about the United States getting sucked into an altercation in the South China Sea by the Chinese.
Jeez.
With good intentions. And then there are weapons exchanges, and it turns out that our carriers and the airplanes on them with avionics are all defeated by cyber warfare from the Chinese.
1 second after.
Now, Admiral Stavridis, who's a wonderful guy, retired. I knew the answer to the question before I asked him. I said, why'd you write this as a novel rather than in some military journal? And it's because I want more people to read it. I want the civilians to read it. This is a very, very serious problem and a high exposure area, and this is the way he brought it to the attention of the American public, to the extent that it was reviewed and passed around. It's a serious problem. Imagine you're an admiral in charge of a carrier battle group.
Everything shuts down.
With the fast frigates and the submarine screen, and all of a sudden nothing works.
Yeah. That's Fortune's book, 1 second after.
And it was a page turner too. I got the publisher sent me the book.
Yeah.
I got it overnight on a Friday afternoon, and about noon Saturday I had finished reading. I read it all night long. I couldn't put it down.
No, that's the gift of reading. Is like, I'll just hole up. And I know that feeling. Especially the cool thing about our job was that we got free books. People would send you books. I mean, and I've told people that, and I know you have a collection of autographed books, and I know I do as well. I'm going to come back to what you're reading, but I have this thing when I get hit with a truck, and there's somebody come in and go, I'll give you $100 for all these books. And the kids, okay, and it's like a lot of the stuff is inked, and it's first editions and stuff like that was signed to you when they came in and sat in the studio with you. And
I've got my copy of Free to Choose, signed by Milton and Rose Friedman.
well, there you
two
are.
of them.
See, and that kind of stuff is, I mean, it's goes along with the job, but I think one of the many reasons that you survived in a business that we both agreed with, sometimes the survivability rate isn't always there, is that you read.
Yeah.
And Woody Page's other great line was, I think Woody wrote a column 3 days a week, and somebody said, oh, you're working 3 days a week or 4 days a week. And Woody said, but I think about it all the time.
Yeah.
And he wasn't being a wise guy saying that. And you still can, your column still goes.
I've been writing a column for better than 40 years.
Didn't you get blown out of the Post?
Well, no, I quit the Post.
What happened?
First time around, they fired me later.
Yeah. There it is.
Mostly it was ideological. Denver Post now is so unbelievably biased and agenda driven and thin and weak.
But they claim they're making money.
Yeah. When the remember Chuck Green?
Oh, well, sure, of course.
Chuck and I became really good friends. We played golf together. When Chuck was at the Denver Post as the editorial page editor, he was left-leaning because the paper was left-leaning. Dick Schlossberg, by the way, was the publisher, and Dick was conservative, by the way. That's one of the reasons they finally took me on. But I would have Chuck on my KNUS show over on Morrison Road, if you remember when they were there. That's when I was doing a 7 to 10 p.m. show.
Yeah.
I had him on. We were cordial. We disagreed. It was good radio, and I liked him.
He's
He
a good
liked
guy.
me.
Yeah, he's a good guy.
One day I have him on. I said, you know, I've done this survey for 2 months now, and every day I take a look at your House editorials, and you're entitled to your House editorials. Those reflect the paper's viewpoint, and then the op-ed columnists. That's when they had 2 full pages of opinion pages. And I've cataloged them. And this is I'm trying to be objective, my appraisal of where they fit on the political spectrum. So what I came up with was, and I don't remember the percentages, but they're close enough for government work. 77% were liberal, 22% were maybe conservative, and a bunch that you can't categorize because they weren't all that political. I don't think that's fair to your readers. And he said, I don't believe that. No, it's nothing like that. I said, well, here's my work on it. Take a look at it and judge for yourself. And I had the names of the columnists and where I placed them. About a week later, he comes back and says, how'd you like to write a column for the paper? This would have been the early 80s. So I wrote a weekly column for the Denver Post.
I remember it well.
For decades. Yeah. At a couple of junctures, by the way, Chuck later became conservative.
Yeah, quite well. Yeah.
And he moved down to Pueblo at a certain point. Yeah. But some of the other editors at the Denver Post were really, really left. And from time to time, they would spike my columns. Yeah. I'd write a column, they wouldn't run it because they disagreed with it. At a certain point, I said, this isn't working anymore, I'm going to go over. And that's when I went to the Rocky Mountain News and stayed at the News until the News folded. Then I came back to the Denver Post. Dean Singleton said, why don't you write a column again for the Denver Post? And then in October, just before the November election in some year, all of a sudden they dumped my column. And it wasn't coincidental. I've written for the Gazette in the Springs and the Denver Gazette here. Complete Colorado runs my column now. That's John Galdero's outfit. So I've always had a continuous stream of column writing, which I enjoy. Doesn't pay a lot of money, by the way, as you well know.
Yes.
But that was part of the package.
But I think we've talked about it, and I used it before, the fire horse, and becomes a garbage horse and wants to still go to the fire. Do you still want to go to the fire?
Which fire are we talking about now?
Politics in Colorado right now, politics in the country, foreign policy decisions. I mean, one of the things you like the fight as well.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and the fight was good.
Well, it's my calling, really.
Yeah, precisely.
Well, I still write the column, and I still read voluminously about public policy because I'm interested in it. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, I did a 4-hour presentation at the Independence Institute for John Caldera to an audience of about 100 about federal finances and the absolute disaster we are in now, running up the national debt to levels that now exceed our debt during the Second World War, when we were fighting for our survival. The debt then was 115% of GDP, gross federal debt. We're now passing that, and we're not fighting for our survival against the Germans and the Japanese. I've been doing a PowerPoint presentation on this before there was PowerPoint. Once upon a time I started with overhead transparencies, but now it's a nice biffy PowerPoint presentation, which I've done all over the country, and I'm still doing it. It's very eye-opening. People have no sense of the magnitude of this until they see this presentation. So yeah, I'm still involved in that.
Do you still want? Well, let me come back to this. Colorado politics, November. What happens in the election? I wrote a bunch of stuff I wanted to ask, but do Republicans have a chance?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
I think that there's going to be a national anti-Democrat pushback. How much of that we'll see in Colorado is problematic. I don't think it'll be at the level of the national pushback, because this state is pretty blue right now. We've got a Denver City Council is to the left of Boulder's City Council. You're familiar with Candy C. DeBaca
very well.
And some of the other crazies on it.
Well, she's an admitted Marxist.
A strong Democrat majority in both houses of the state legislature, and a Democrat governor, and a Democrat in every statewide office except for one seat on the Colorado Board of Regents, CU Board of Regents, Heidi Grinnell.
Yeah.
It's going to be tough to push that back, but I think that Michael Bennet is vulnerable. Remember, he was appointed to that Senate seat by Governor Bill Ritter.
Absolutely.
He ran for re-election a few years after that and got barely 50% of the vote.
It was a split, that's right.
He did terribly trying for the Democrat nomination for president. He's really been an ineffective senator. He likes to present himself as a moderate, and he's certainly no Bernie Sanders left-winger. But if he were a true moderate, he'd be with Joe Manchin, pushing back on this ridiculous progressive tide in Washington, and he's not. So Joe O'Dea has gotten the nomination run against him, which is good because Ron Hanks was not electable in Colorado. Ron's a solid conservative, rural Colorado. He can get elected in a safe congressional, not a congressional, in a state legislative district, but he can't win a statewide race. Heidi Grinnell is a really good candidate against Jared Polis. However, Jared is not a radical left-winger, but he is a Democrat, and he's beholden to their coalition. And while he's vetoed a couple of things in this legislative session, he hasn't vetoed anything that's really important, and he has enabled the very left-wing drift of the state legislature, but he is perceived as a moderate by the electorate because compared to the radicals in the legislature, he's not as radical as they are.
Is he the smartest politician in Colorado?
Yeah, he's as smooth as Bill Clinton.
Yeah,
he really
very
is.
Good. I think so.
Articulate, wise.
Yeah.
He's the first person to tell you that the last job in the world he wants is president of the United States.
Which is the one he wants.
Don't you believe it?
I'm with you. I said
he's going to be, or I think he imagines himself to be the first gay president, and it's certainly possible. Yeah.
Donald Trump.
I just want him to go away.
Yeah.
Go away, Donald. Be gone. He's a negative influence now in the task at hand, which is to get back the White House and get a Republican majority in both houses of Congress. You're going to be governed by Republicans or Democrats. They're the only two parties that matter, and this is why I explain why party trumps person. There are some good people on both sides of the aisle, to be sure, but only one party is going to have the legislative majority, either it's in a state legislature or in Congress. The party that has the most noses in the House and Senate controls every committee chairmanship, every subcommittee chairmanship. They are the party that governs. The same thing applies to the president. Look at Joe Biden right now. He's an empty suit. I'm sorry for the guy. I mean, he's losing his faculties. Your faculties and mine aren't as strong as they were when we were younger, but we're way ahead of Uncle Joe. All right? But he's just a person. If Joe Biden were to step down tomorrow and Kamala Harris were president, or if somehow they bypassed her and somebody else was, it would still be a Democrat, and it would still be somebody who's answerable to the Democrat coalition. And the Democrat coalition is different from the Republican coalition. The Democrat coalition and its agenda will be advanced when they're in power, just as the Republicans will when they're in power. Right now, the Democrat coalition is radical progressives, big labor unions, especially the teachers' union.
Well, they're government unions.
Radical environmentalists, identity politics, wokeness, global warming extremists. I could go through the whole list. I'm sure you know as well as I do. And their coalition is much better organized than ours, than the Republican coalition, because they're already pre-organized in their own groups. Academics, K through 12 education, higher education, way left, and indoctrinating the kids so effectively you can see that polls show that younger people think socialism is better than capitalism, and they don't understand either one of them. So you're going to be governed by this agenda or that agenda. And if there isn't a big pushback to begin with in 2022 and again in 2024, I don't hold out much hope for reversing this thing.
If Donald Trump announces before the midterms, which I think he will because he has to be self-protective in the January 6th committee, and he jumps in, and then what the Supreme Court did, and although they did not make a decision on Roe Wade, but they did, and I know Republican women who are very upset with that decision. It's a mix. It's a witch's brew. If Donald Trump sometime next month or this month says, I'm running, what does that do?
It's bad. It's all bad. And the reason why he might do it sooner rather than later, Ron DeSantis is picking up a lot of steam, and Trump, I don't think, if he does have delusions about running for president in 2024, he doesn't want DeSantis to get too far ahead of the curve and start locking up money and support that isn't going to be reversed. Otherwise, he might have held back. Now he might move more quickly. Is he electable? I don't think so. Yeah, he's got a core. It's maybe 25% of the electorate. And for that core, he can do no wrong. But that core isn't enough to win in a presidential election now. At the margin, what really hurt him, and you know, less than 50,000 votes in 3 states was the difference between him winning or losing in 2020 if they had flipped to the other side. One of the biggest constituencies he lost were women who lean Republican, who are college educated, who live in the suburbs. That was enough to flip those 50,000 votes in the 3 states that would have gone the other way for him, perhaps. He'll never get them back because of his persona. A lot of great policy came out of his administration. Much of it would have come out of any Republican administration. But he's going to be 2 years older. His style is just so put offish for too many people. Now he's playing games, endorsing people in various state races, and I do mean playing games.
Oh, absolutely.
He has reversed some of his endorsements when the poll shows that they were going to lose. It's helped some people, it's hurt some other people, but it's producing, in some cases, people in swing districts, in congressional swing districts, that are too far right to get elected in a swing district. So you settle for a Republican who's not as conservative as the Republican mainstream, but who's much better than the Democrat. Remember when Don Rumsfeld, in the early stages of the Iraq War, and when those Humvees weren't sufficiently armored to protect them from IEDs, because we didn't know about IEDs. After a while, they got refigured so they were stronger. But he was talking to some troops out in the field who were complaining about that. He was listening sympathetically, and he said, you know, we go to war with the army we have, not the one we wish we have. You go to an election with the electorate you have, not the one you wish you have. And when I try to talk to some conservatives who are less practical than I am, and God knows I'm not a rhino, they reimagine the electorate that we have to be the electorate that they want to have, and if that's not the case, we lose.
A rhino, I define a rhino now as somebody who doesn't believe the big lie.
Yeah.
Now you're a rhino. Well, wait a minute, stop. And I've been called that many times. I said, please, but a rhino is someone who says, look, this wasn't stolen from Donald Trump. He lost. The women, there was a great line, I think we talked about it one night, that Donald Trump reminded these women of their ex-husband. And I mean, which is a throwaway line, but and so he needs to go away. And Joe Biden needs to go away. If this country can do, but how you went through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and all of this, how divided relative to other times is the country right now?
Not as divided as the Civil War.
There's one, all right.
Not as divided as the Revolutionary War, when they were still loyalists to King George.
There's two. The Tories.
I think even more divided than it was in the radical 60s and early
I
70s.
agree.
And we saw violence then too. We had these bombings.
No, I agree.
But the younger people then, who were going through the hippie phase and the anti-war phase and who demonstrated, there weren't enough of them to prevent Richard Nixon from getting elected
Twice
in 68 and 72. And 72 is a landslide. The only state that voted for George McGovern was Massachusetts.
This wasn't even his own state.
His home state didn't even vote for him. So no, the gulf is so much different, bigger today, and so much farther apart, because a lot of it has to do with the role of government and how big government has gotten. And so many people are just committed to increasing the size of government. When the number of net tax payers is overwhelmed by the number of net tax receivers, you're getting to a point of no return. The factions are so much different today. The whole notion of assimilation in this country, that we're a melting pot. Now we're a salad bowl.
Yes.
And you can tell the cucumbers from the tomatoes, from the lettuce.
Yes.
That's not healthy. The Biden policies of what we've got is open borders right now. You know, it's interesting. Polls are showing now that that generations, that is multi generational, meaning they've been here for a number of generations, of Latinos are against open borders. So the Democrats are miscalculating the Latino vote, and we've seen this in some Texas districts now
and
as
young
well.
Latino women running anti the open border. Now they're great indicators. They're harbingers of what I hope to come. But come back to
also just one last point on that. Latinos are overwhelmingly Catholic.
Oh yeah, conservative.
And a majority of Latinos are against abortion. The Democrats think this abortion game that they're on right now, trying to divert attention from all the other problems, is going to get them a lot of votes. Most of the people who are movement pro-life, who are movement pro-abortion, movement pro-abortion, already vote for Democrats. You're not going to get any. They can only vote once.
You know, and from my reading, most abortions are done over the counter. That women buy these the day after, morning after kits.
Good point.
And it isn't this physical operation. I mean, there's so much mix. I'm going to come back to the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, when Richard Nixon resigns and the war ends, music changes, clothes change, disco hits, everybody's happy. We have a couple years of Jimmy Carter, then you get Ronald Reagan. So I really see, well, okay, that was that. But that isn't now. And now is... I'm reading a great historian who believes that we have 2 more generations if we don't right this ship. So we both have grandkids, and so would be my grandson's children. You and I be long gone, and somebody get to look at this tape. There's those old guys that did that radio show. But what's what they were saying towards the end of it? So if we don't pull this together, Michael, then what?
Who knows?
I'm serious. I'm really scared. My race is run. Your race is run. But I know how you feel about it. Now it's your 3rd generation, my grandson. What's going to happen to this kid?
What's going to happen to the country?
Yeah, exactly.
A country, the average life of
350 years.
Yeah, and even less than that. I think just over maybe 250, some number. And fiscal policy, bankruptcy, inflation. Has been drivers for that, and that's the path we're headed on. The younger K through 12 and higher education has so successfully indoctrinated so many young kids, and I don't see how that's going to be reversed anytime soon. I've got an 11-year-old granddaughter living in Florida now. She's a very smart kid. I like her. She likes me. She told her mom a year ago, I really like Grandpa Mickey. I'm Grandpa Mickey.
No, I get it.
But she says, and I know he's a Republican, but I'm a Democrat, she says, because they're nicer. They're nicer.
Yeah. We went to McDonald's.
Where'd she learn that? School.
Yeah. Going to McDonald's. I said, why do you want to go to McDonald's? He said, the man on television told me to.
impressionable, no?
Absolutely. I don't know what's waiting. I don't want to get. I promised myself I'd get one more in there, and that's the shape of talk radio, where talk radio is today, versus, back when we're talking about ratings and revenue and all the rest of the stuff. Talk to that for a minute, and then we got to do with you and I and Lee together, because you didn't get to tell the Limbaugh story either. Ooh, Larson's going to shoot me. So
and he knows that story.
Well, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Talk radio.
You pick.
I gave up five-day-a-week radio about 5 years ago, but I've still been in it, right? I do fill-ins. I do a week at a time. During the pandemic, I only wanted to do 4 or 5 weeks a year, and I did close to 10 because of the pandemic.
Were you at home, or did you come to the studio?
I came to the studio.
I did too.
I did some from home, but I prefer to go to the studio.
Me too. Yeah.
I noticed a change in the caller end of talk radio, and I didn't like it. Back in the golden days, we'd have 4 lines, and they'd always be full, and someone would drop off, and we've got people lined up to come on the air. One of my favorite things about doing talk radio was interaction with callers, especially callers with whom I disagreed.
Bingo.
And I had a lot of guests with whom I disagreed.
Bingo.
I like the give and take. Somebody makes a statement, fine, here's my rebuttal. So many of them couldn't go any farther than their opening statement. They hadn't thought it through. And once you start to expand the conversation, they can't go that far. But almost all those exchanges were civil, except for the crazies that sometimes called in, who I would introduce to Mr. Holdbutton after they finished their tirade and never stopped talking. That interaction now is disappearing. People aren't calling in. Unless you have some sillier topic that really catches their interest. If it's a public policy issue, they're not calling in. Maybe because they just want to drop a bomb and can't defend it. Maybe because they don't want to be bothered calling in. Maybe because younger people don't talk on the phone. They don't even answer their cell phones. So on our station, a lot of the talk show hosts are now reading text messages.
What's turned into?
Yeah. There's no interaction there, and people can drop bombs with text messages too. And they've had their say and get their gun, and they don't have to defend it. That was one of the reasons I decided to walk away from it. I just don't want to do that kind of text message reading radio.
I've told people the Alan Berg story when we had snail mail, and we're working together, and we would get letters, and you would get tons of letters, and he would open the letter, look to the back. If it wasn't signed, he threw it out. And now we have this blind ability for people just to send you some pretty nasty stuff. And I went through it with the last year after Donald Trump got beat, and saying, well, come on, Trump really, Trump lost, and the attack was on full scale. And they were people that, some of the things that were said, and some of the actions were like, this is way over the edge. But you're right about their sports. You listen to some of the national sports shows. They don't even take calls. They read, and you don't know if it's their producer sending them a really cool advocate question. 2 other ones. You were people don't know this. You were a Supreme Court case, or became what you did on the radio, if I remember correctly, becomes a Supreme Court case, does it not?
Which one?
When the guy with the flag burner.
Oh yeah. Well, no, it was Joey Johnson from Texas.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Bingo.
I remember that.
Yeah.
There were statutes around the country in various states that made flag burning a crime. Joey Johnston, who was an actual member of some communist group, he was the one that burned a flag. It became a Supreme Court case, and that's when the Supreme Court regarded this as the First Amendment protection. I had him on the show.
I remember this, really. You name called him, I believe. Body parted him, I think you body parted him.
We went back and forth. I mean, he was, irrational and angry and this and that. I wanted to keep the debate on substance, but it wasn't possible to do that. I just cited that Supreme Court case when I was talking to him, and that's now been expanded to other areas. Free speech is when you talk. Yeah. And the founders were very, very, very careful about protecting that. But all expression is not the same as talking.
I agree.
And some expression goes beyond bounds, like fighting words.
Yeah, sure.
And that's also a Supreme Court precedent.
Fire in the theater.
Some words are so inflammatory that they can be regarded as fighting words, and if someone responds with violence to that, he's going to be protected from prosecution under certain circumstances. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater unless there's actually a fire.
Yeah.
That would protect truth is a defense.
Sure.
Yeah, so the Joey Johnson incident was fun, and I enjoyed having him on the air. I didn't change his mind, obviously.
No. But didn't that end up? That ended up in front of the court, did it not?
What part of it?
I think you called him a name, but that was so what? But the idea of being able to burn a flag, and this was my expression of the First Amendment. I thought that was part of that, if I remember correctly.
I'm not sure if I know what you're referring to.
But I remember you came in and
it wasn't the F word.
No, it was the A word.
Yeah. Oh, the asshole.
Yeah, that was the word.
Yeah, I think you can get away with asshole.
Can you do that? Well, yeah, you can get away with the F word.
You know, another one, and this was brought up, westward, when there were the layoffs recently on Clear Channel here in Colorado. Westward happened to mention that I won't be doing fill-ins anymore, which was true. And then they also recalled that Greg Foster, who was my boss, the program director, he was also let go too. Well, I can't imagine why they. Anyway, that Greg Foster some years ago had given me permission to use the word nigger on air.
Yeah.
Right. And I asked him about that first. And they reminded Westward. Michael Roberts wrote the piece, and I like Michael.
I do too.
He, since that was brought up, he explained the context of it and why it was justified. There's a college professor whose name escapes me, who's black, who wrote a book about the word nigger, and nigger was in the title of the book. When you use some of those, the George Carlin words that you can't use on air gratuitously, your FCC license is at risk. However, if you're clinically talking about something, you can use the word in that context. And I was talking about a specific incident regarding the use of the word, Mark Twain.
Who's no longer in elementary school libraries.
Now they're canceling Mark Twain because the word nigger was in there.
Sure.
And I discussed that on air, and I said the word in that context. Because it struck me as silly to say, the N-word is in the book. I mean, that's infantile. So I said it with good reason, didn't get in any trouble for it because of the context. No.
But anymore, it's one of the reasons why things like this operate. And believe me, when I'm sitting here listening to you say what you just said, we'll catch heat for that. You can count on it.
You should, not from rational people.
No, but...
You know, someone wants to play the cancel game. Hey, I've got an opportunity. I'm going to jump in now. No, nobody can intellectually defend their being offended by my using the word nigger in that context.
What was the highlight of all the stuff that you did, and what was the low light?
I can think of highlights, but there are so many of them. It's almost impossible.
That's what Lee kind of said all the day after day.
You know, talking to Milton Friedman on the air as a guest on several occasions, William F. Buckley Jr. These are some of my intellectual heroes. Mickey Mantle. Mickey Mantle, he was my boyhood hero growing up in New York as a Yankee fan. He and I became friends. You know, I talked to presidents, Jim Brown in the studio.
Oh, you bet.
Shook my hand disappeared. His hand is the size of a catcher's mitt. I've got the book signed by Jim Brown and my buddy Mike. So many people I met, places I went to. There's no one that really stands out. I think about 100 of them are tied for first place.
Yeah, I feel the same way. You can't put it together. What was the moment you said, what am I doing? Did you have the tough one? The moment you go, whoa, wait a minute. I think everybody that survives in this business has a moment. They go, ouch, I wish I hadn't done that.
Yeah, I can think of one. By the way, you know what the dump switch is.
Sure.
You got it on your panel over here.
We live with it. Yeah.
If a caller uses the F word, there's a 7-second delay. You hit the dump switch, and it never happened. I once dumped myself because
You said it?
I may have been the F word or something else. It just came out, but I dumped it so no one ever heard it. But I had Dan Rather on the show. He was in Denver, whatever the local affiliate was. He was there, and they asked if I'd like to have him on my show, and so I had him on the show. As a matter of fact, it was a special. I was on at 6 p.m., which I normally wouldn't be, just to have him on. We went back and forth, and he recoiled at my calling him liberal. He said he's conservative, and we went back and forth on it. And it was civil. Renelda Muse, by the way, was on that station. She called me later, and she was outraged because of the way I treated Dan Rather, because I didn't
kowtow.
I didn't kowtow to him. Good word. And one point I said, "Didn't you write?"
I remember this moment.
Didn't you write the?
It was Moyers, I think.
Yeah, it was Bill Moyers who actually did it.
Yeah.
Didn't you do the one, the TV ad against Barry Goldwater, where the little girl's killed in a mushroom cloud?
Yeah,
and as soon as I said that, I said, no, it was Bill Moyers. It wasn't Dan Rather. And he said I didn't do it. And I said, I know you didn't do it. So anyway, that was something. I'm sorry that came out of my mouth.
No, that's how Moyers.
Yeah.
By the way, what a powerful ad.
Yeah, it was powerful.
Oh, man.
And Goldwater lost, in a landslide to Barry Goldwater.
Final story, I get a chance to meet Barry Goldwater.
There's a sidebar on that too.
Okay, good. But Barry Goldwater's a great line.
Somebody once said, somebody told me if I voted for Barry Goldwater, then we'd be in Vietnam for another 5 or 6 years.
Riots in the streets.
Yeah, well, I voted for Barry Goldwater, and they were right. But of course, Johnson won.
He went down a litany of things.
Yeah.
He said there'd be riots in the streets. This is what happened. He said, so, he did an interview. That was a highlight. Because it was Barry Goldwater, for God's sake. He's sitting there talking to you like you're an okay guy. Man, dude, you're Barry Goldwater. Mm-hmm. You ever get this final moment when you sit and look at the guy and you go, you know who you really, you're like this guy. Yeah. And then are there guys, are there men or women that you wish you'd have never met? They go,
never met?
Never met. You go, you held them in esteem.
Oh, then find out that their feet are clay.
Yeah.
Well, there were plenty of people who, when I met, I was really surprised as to how weak they were, but I wouldn't say I was, meaning disillusioned because I worshiped this guy. And
you thought, wow, and it really does prove everybody's just a human being anyhow. But
I can't remember anything specifically where I said I wish I never met him. But I was disappointed in some people who I had held in higher regard and then found out they weren't as deserving of that.
How much golf you playing?
Well, when I was 35, 40 years old and daydreaming about, I'm going to retire someday and play a lot of golf. I'll play 4 or 5 days a week. I didn't know that my body wouldn't agree with me. So, I've got all the human body hates golf, hates the golf swing. And I've got some physical difficulties that I didn't have when I was younger. But I'm playing 3 days a week now if my body lets me. Yeah, not very well.
One of the great stories, Darryl Luby, who we both know and love. Luby loved to ski, so he said, I'm going to quit radio and get a ski shop. 2 years later, he's back. I said, what's up? He said, I just ran that ski shop all the time. I never went skiing. He said, great, I got to get back into radio so I can go and ski. You're also a very good skier and all those kinds of things, but now
we used to do the Winter Park Cup every year.
Every year, and I want to bring that back. Rich Carless is now running the NSCD.
Good.
Yeah, Richie I just had lunch with him. Thank you. It really meant a lot. We should do one and get Larson and you.
Happy to, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think who else would fit in that circle, but to tell stories. And it's a golden era, or a golden age maybe. Do you think it's gone?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah, the internet is so much bigger than talk radio, and everybody in the country is a talk show host now.
Yeah.
People have so many other places they can go. That's one of the reasons why we're dividing up an audience into so many more pieces. It's tough to get a big share anymore.
Tip O'Neill once said, all politics is local. I believe all talk radio is local, and I think it was one of your skills.
Big element, yep.
You kept it local and kept it done like that. Mike Rosen, everybody. You still want to work?
Not 5 days a week, no, definitely not.
That's an opening.
Yeah.
We'll talk next. See you next time on The Shoot. Thanks to Mark Crowley. Take care of yourselves, everybody. Thanks for watching.